Welcome. Are you ready?
Yeah.
Welcome, everybody. It's Spessy here, and what big news we have in DC Lorcana, the first ever balance update in the game's history. I'm joined by my friend and top player, Jan Moyen. Instant feelings, mate. Is this a good or a bad change?
I think that's definitely for the better of the game. Immediately, there's a bunch of decks that come to mind that have been unplayable because they just turbo lose to Bucky discard, and excited to see them resurface.
Okay, I agree. I definitely agree. Let's give the article a quick read. Changes coming with Shimmering Skies. Hello, Disney Lorcana TCG players. We have an announcement regarding a card that will be receiving Arata in all formats, starting with the Shimmering Skies hobby release on the 9th of August. Arata is not something we take lightly or want to do too often, so we want to give some context for our plans. Arata and bans going forward will be planned to be effective at the hobby launch of the next set, unless a change is deemed immediately necessary. We want to preserve a fun environment for the game and address cards that cause negative experience for players at all levels. We're looking for ways to make printed versions of the updated card available to players later this year, and it will be corrected in any future printings. Starting 9th of August, the following card will be changed. Okay, and this is the change. Bucky Squirrel Squeak Tutor from the second set is going from 2 cost to 3, but that's not it. It's also losing his ward ability, but that's not it. It's also changing its ability where now, whenever you play a Floodborn character, if you used Shift to play them, each opponent chooses and discards a card. Jan, this is a very, very heavy-handed nerf, isn't it? They've not just hit Bucky in one way, not just 2, but 3 different ways. Is this card going to see any competitive play moving forwards?
No, I think has very much at least removed it from competitive play. I think any of those 3 changes on its own would have been a lot to deal with already, but all of those 3 together, I don't think we're going to see it anymore.
Yeah, so there's a bit of context they've added here. Ursula's return gave Bucky players the opportunity to discard multiple cards from opponent's hand as early as turn 2, while building up a board that was very difficult to interact with, creating a stressful environment that just wasn't fun. Ward also made Bucky close to untouchable, taking away player agency to deal with a powerful and cheap threat. For these reasons, we're increasing his Bucky cost to 3 and removing Ward from him. Additionally, we feel like requiring Shift better represents the Floodborn experience, as many decks utilizing Bucky have mostly ignored using the Shift mechanic outside of one Sinister Bird. So, definitely agree with Jan that this is no longer Bucky going to be seeing any sort of competitive play, which kind of begs the question, why make an errata change, which is potentially quite confusing? Also, it's going to be more expensive for Ravensburger compared with an outright ban. And we are going to be looking at, in a moment, some of the messages from Rochelle in the official Discord, who's the community manager at Disney Lorcana, to kind of explain a little bit more about why they decided to go for an errata change compared with an outright ban. Finally, to just finish off reading the article, please keep in mind for challenge events, Shimmering Skies will be legal on August 30th, but the errata will go into effect immediately. This is immediately when Shimmering Skies releases. So the challenge event in Toronto on the weekend prior will have the errata in effect, even though Shimmering Skies is not legal for this event. We apologise for missing the mark on this card and hope you understand we're taking the steps to preserve a fun experience. Lastly, as we'd like the Disney Lorcana TCG to remain a welcoming experience for players new to TCGs, please be understanding and helpful with those who may not follow changes like this. They can be tough to keep up with, so we're working to provide an update on the app as soon as we can. Okay, so huge nerfs, making the card absolutely unplayable in a competitive sense. I have to say, I am thrilled at this change. Honestly, the one thing I'm a bit disappointed about is the fact that this errata is not coming into effect for the Disney Lorcana Challenge in Bologna. I do make sense that the timing doesn't quite add up because Bologna is, I think, a week or 2 before the release of Shimmering Skies, and they're just wanting to set that precedent that bans and errata changes come into place with the release of a new set. But while I think it makes sense to keep Bucky as it is for the set championships because they're currently ongoing, I personally would have loved to have seen Bologna without Bucky to just see how that is going to shape up the meta. So let's talk about, we've touched on it already, Jan. was Bucky the card to hit? Do you think there was an argument for Diablo to be hit? And why do you think they decided to go with Bucky instead?
Um, I think Bucky was very much the card to be hit, and I think the reason for that is that this is very much not interactable with. It's like there's other cards like Diablo where if you don't interact with it, you get punished. But at least there's a bunch of ways to deal with Diablo. There's not really a bunch of ways to deal efficiently with turn two Bucky. I don't really think they exist.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think that the thing is with Bucky is there's so many cards that have the Floodborn tag, and obviously the shift mechanic is something quite unique to Disney Lorcana, and I think it's definitely a mechanic we can continue to see more cards being printed pretty much every set with the shift keyword and Floodborn tag, and therefore that is very limiting on the design space. So not only do I think it's kind of aimed at that current situation where the Bucky decks do feel quite oppressive, but also just to allow the developers to have that freedom to print as many Floodborn characters as they want. I mean, a bit of an example is Beast Tragic Hero. That has the Floodborn tag, but the shift aspect of that card is currently somewhat irrelevant most of the time. Although we did actually see this weekend someone playing Morph with Beast and shifting it in on turn 3. But usually the shift ability of Beast isn't that relevant. And what I could see the design team wanting to do is, let's say in a year's time where Beast Tragic Hero starts to see less competitive play, then suddenly they print a 1-cost Beast, for example, and then that shift ability on Beast becomes much more relevant, and therefore that helps keep the card in the meta for a longer period of time. And I think that they want to have this Floodborn tag able to be put on lots of characters to support other cards like Blue Fairy, Chief Bogo, but the Bucky overall was just too oppressive and limiting of design space. Are you surprised they've gone so heavy-handed? For example, I think that it would have been absolutely reasonable to go for 3 ink cost, remove the ward, and keep the squeak ability the same. Are you surprised they've gone in as hard as they have?
Yeah, to some extent, I'm very surprised. And then on the other hand, I think I think the last thing that they would want to do is errata the card and then still have issues with it. So I think that's just a very safe errata.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah,
But yeah,
no,
I'm
I definitely
surprised
agree.
enough for that much.
Yeah, I was also thinking that maybe with an errata like this, is it possible that they're wanting to over nerf it and then over time buff it back up? But that definitely doesn't seem like the case with the screenshots we're going to be looking at shortly, which do seem to suggest that they're going to be providing players with this reprinted Bucky very, very easily. It's not going to be in future sets as a printed card. Most likely the way it's going to happen, and this is not confirmed, most likely local game stores will be sent out like a big batch of Bucky cards, and then those can just be handed out to players very, very easily. But obviously, from a cost perspective, it would be a lot more simple to just simply ban Bucky and avoid reprinting, particularly because the new Bucky is not going to be competitively viable. Were you surprised to see they've gone for an errata change rather than a ban?
Yeah, I didn't expect it, to be honest. I guess their reason to me must be that they still printed some cards that like with Bucky in mind, and maybe they wouldn't really work without the Bucky, and they just wanted to keep the set intact. But still, I thought a ban would have been the likelier scenario.
We know many of you have been surprised by the errata to Bucky, and we want to reiterate that this was done for the good of the game as a whole and not as any sort of fix to competitive play. Additionally, our approach to errata, rather than ban in this instance, was a unique case. We are planning support for printings of additional languages in the future and want to deliver a fully playable experience to our future fans, rather than having those players have one less card in Emerald. Banning is still a tool in our toolbox that we will deploy if necessary in the future, and one we would typically prefer over a drastic errata like this. So I think that does make sense that Ravensburger are wanting to avoid releasing Rise of the Floodborn in different countries for the first time with just 203 cards instead of 204. Do you think this is enough of a reason to go for the errata over than just a strict ban?
Maybe I don't know. I don't think it would have been the end of the world if there's one less of an Emerald card.
Yep.
In general. But what I'm what I'm happy to see is that this this is just for the health of the game, because I think competitively we had a very healthy meta even with Bucky. Competitively, it didn't need to be banned, but still, I think for the total of the game, I think the game will be much more enjoyable without Bucky in the game. So
Yep.
that makes
No, I
sense.
definitely agree. I think the first deck in my entire time playing this in Lorcana, which I've actively disliked, is this Emerald Steel Bucky deck. A lot of people know me, Jan, as kind of the Emerald Steel guy, but I'm very much the opposite of an Emerald Steel guy in the set 4 metagame, because it's just not a deck I enjoy watching, playing, or mostly playing against. And I do think that the removal of Bucky is going to really open up the set 4 meta for Toronto in particular. Again, that's why I wish it would come into effect sooner for Bologna, because the Emerald Steel deck, the whole meta is warped around. It has a big part of the meta share, and every deck which is competitively viable has to be able to beat Bucky relatively consistently. Otherwise, it's just not a serious option. So I think that there's going to be an abundance of decks which suddenly come out of the woodwork to really shake up the meta. I think a lot of people of the opinion that in this Toronto tournament, for example, that suddenly Ruby Amethyst is just going to be the deck to beat. But I really don't think that's going to be the case, because I think the meta is going to completely change on its head. There's going to be new decks which previously were just not serious options are now going to be much more serious options. And of course, Emerald as a whole is going to change the way it's built entirely. So Emerald no longer going down the Bucky Floodborn route. Suddenly we might be seeing more aggressive Emerald decks like Merfolks, and I think Prince John in particular is very likely to make a comeback. What's your opinion, Jan, on how the set 4 meta is going to change with this change to Bucky in Toronto?
So I think there's lots of things that change just meta-wise, because I think a big reason for why the Sapphire Steel and Ruby Sapphire decks existed in the meta was that they were beating up Emerald Steel. So they will probably take a little bit of a backseat. And red purple will rise. So from those decks that we know, those would be like the first impressions. But I think there will be much more going on than that. And lots of decks maybe that were being held back by Bucky, but actually have a decent matchup into Ruby Amethyst. I think those could all see the light of day. And the first decks that come to mind regarding this specific scenario would be definitely green purple, which wasn't great against Emerald Steel.
Yep,
But
absolutely.
beat Ruby Amethyst. And then other than that, I also think like different iterations of Ruby Amber could come back. Either Mufasa or a more song heavy flute Amber Ruby.
Locations? Just in time locations?
Eh,
Kind of agree. Yeah, I kind of agree. I think the other thing to bear in mind, Jan, is while a lot of people are going to instantly think, oh, Ruby Amethyst is just going to be on its own in the S tier, a big reason for Ruby Amethyst's success in Bochum this weekend is it has dominant matchups into Ruby Sapphire and Sapphire Steel. And now both of those decks, as you mentioned, were really in a position because they were good against Bucky. So if less people are playing those decks because you no longer need to be so heavily tech for Bucky, that also means that Ruby Amethyst isn't going to have as much of a good matchup into the rest of the metagame, which is why I think a lot of people are really underestimating how impactful this one change is. And that's another reason why I'm such a big fan of it. Just by changing one card, essentially banning it, but just nerfing it into the ground where it's not going to see any competitive play, in my opinion, just leaves the metagame absolutely wide open, which is why I would love to have seen in Bologna this change added, but of course it just doesn't quite add up timing wise. But I do think that means that Toronto, which previously is not an event I was that excited for, simply because it was the last event in the cycle of Ursula's return, and the meta we've had this set is definitely not as open as we had in Into the Inklands. Suddenly Toronto is honestly the most interesting tournament of them all for me. Like, it's just a one tournament metagame where it's not going to be the same for any other tournament. And I think that there's such big potential for players to really win in the deck builder in that event.
Which makes me quite sad because I was heavily contemplating going, but
Me
it's during my
too.
holiday.
Yeah.
So I'm not partaking in it, but I would love to. I think those metas are very, very fun that are not figured out just yet.
Yeah. I'm the same. I was actually looking this morning to see if there was any tickets still available for Toronto. I've signed up for the wait list, but I imagine if that was to come through, it would be very, very short notice. And then, of course, I wouldn't have flights booked and stuff. So definitely a shame. I don't think I'm going to be able to make it, but it does seem like a great tournament to watch from home either way. So I think the other question, Jan, is what is going to happen to Emerald now? So you mentioned maybe Emerald Amethyst being a good option because I definitely agree that's a deck which has a lot of legs, and the main reason I've personally not been playing it is because I don't think it has a good matchup into Bucky. Do you think there's any other Emerald decks which have potential? Is it the return of Prince John?
I think for Emerald Steel itself, it will probably be the return of like Merfolk, Prince John, like similar how it was played in set 3, maybe more aggressive approach.
Yep.
But yeah, I'm really looking forward to seeing new color combinations this set and next set with Emerald because I think with Bucky being gone, because Emerald has lots of interesting cards, but so far nothing really compared to Emerald Steel, the Bucky Emerald Steel lines in this set. But now without Bucky and also with next set, I think we'll probably see some new Emerald pairings, which is exciting.
Yeah. So in my experience playing non-Bucky versions of Emerald this set, a big problem is your matchup into Bucky decks in particular was really unfavored because they just have this card which you can't touch and is getting a bunch of discard, whereas you're trying to maybe be a little bit more aggressive. It just didn't really work out in your favor. So I absolutely agree that seeing some other Bucky decks some non-Emerald Bucky decks pop up could be really, really interesting. I've definitely got my eye on some aggressive decks with Merfolk, Flynn Rider, Prince John. I think, as you mentioned, Emerald Amethyst, with especially this Ursula Sea Witch Queen as a shift option, I think could be really, really interesting. But equally, I've got my eye on Emerald Ruby because I think that's a deck which has really got some legs. It just didn't really quite make sense to play it when you could play Emerald Steel Bucky. Of course, a big advantage of Emerald Steel is your Ursula Deceiver of all being able to sing songs like Storm Rage On and Strength of a Raging Fire. But in set 4, your Ursula is a lot more prone to removal thanks to Brawl being very popular, for example. So while I do think that Emerald Steel with a lower curve with cards like Benja, more similar lists to what we saw in set 3, I honestly think that Emerald might be better off with other pairings. Things like Emerald Ruby, Emerald Amethyst, who knows, maybe. I'm not convinced that Emerald Amber's going to be the way to go because I think a big advantage of these Under the Sea decks is that they do have quite a good matchup into Bucky and they're maybe a little bit slow. But I think Emerald just having a more aggressive curve is most likely the way it's going to go, and that's going to really shift up the metagame, in my opinion. And I do think that that Ruby Amethyst is been in a good place in the metagame currently. I still think it's going to be good, but I really doubt that it's just going to be the dominant deck. What do you think do you think Ruby Amethyst is going to be the best deck in this mini set 3 metagame once Bucky's banned?
I
Set
think
4 rather.
I think at first yes, and then maybe people catch up to some new good decks that are also good into Ruby Amethyst. But it's like it's the easy answer to just say okay, Ruby Amethyst is going to be the best, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the case once things settle down.
Yeah, I really don't think it's going to happen. I think that some other decks will come out of the woodworks, and I think that while Ruby Amethyst I think is going to stay consistently good, I think it might end up harming somehow the deck more than people think. Obviously, the Emerald Steel matchup was considered pretty bad for Ruby Amethyst, but I think we also saw this weekend a lot of Ruby Amethyst players really finding the ways to make that matchup a lot more even than people expected it to be. And I just think that because the meta has been so warped around Bucky, decks like Ruby Sapphire, decks like Sapphire Steel, and also just so many decks having cards like Baboom and Smash and all these sorts of things, which don't do much against Ruby Amethyst. Suddenly, those kinds of cards you're just going to be able to include maybe text for Ruby Amethyst. Things like Crab could come back into Amethyst Steel decks, for example, rather than lots of Babooms. And it's going to be really interesting to see how everything settles. So overall, Jan, closing thoughts. Are you happy with this? And
Yeah.
do you think this sets a strong precedent moving forward, or is there anything you're concerned about?
No, not concerned about anything. I'm a little bit surprised they errated it and not banned it, but I don't mind it at all, and I'm very happy Bucky is being dealt with, and I'm happy that they are willing to do something like this if something ever gets as problematic as Bucky did in this set.
Yep, I completely agree with that sentiment. I think it's super, super promising for the game's future. I think the fact that we're a year into the game and this is the first time it's been necessary is also great and just really shows that the Balance team, in my opinion, definitely know what they're doing. And I think their selection of card to nerf is spot on. I think a lot of people might have been tempted to see like a Diablo nerfed, but I think the fact that Bucky is also a card which is so readily available, just being an uncommon. It's also not like it's a card that people have spent a bunch of money on and is now unplayable, because I think that would leave players feeling quite unhappy. So overall, I think pretty much bang on. I actually like that the card has not been banned and is still playable. I think, like, for example, for people like the Artist, that this card is still in the game. And I think also Ravensburger maybe, I mean, my hunch based off kind of what they've said in the Discord, it's not true, but my kind of initial impression is they wanted to avoid banning cards, because then you kind of get into the realm of having formats where you can play with banned cards, and that could, I think they probably just want to keep the competitive players on, one style of play. So I like the ban. I like that it's heavy-handed. I do think, honestly, it's a little too heavy-handed. Like, I'm not really convinced that the change to the squeak ability was super necessary, but I can see that they obviously just wanted to ensure that, they're banning a card essentially, or they're heavily nerfing it, and they definitely don't want it to cause any future problems, which this is certainly going to do. But it is also a shame. I think if it was a digital card game, which is where my background is in predominantly, they would have the ability to nerf it less heavy-handedly and then kind of see where they're at and then nerf it further if needed. But obviously in a physical card game, they're wanting to avoid doing these updates as much as possible. Do you think there's any other cards currently in the game which could get a ban or nerfed in the future?
Maybe in the future, but I think in their current state, I don't think we need any further erratas or bans.
Yep.
But the funniest thing about people always thinking that they'd be much better at game design was when Jafar was first revealed and everyone was going bonkers about it, and it's been completely fine ever since. It was never a problematic card, really.
Yep. Jafar's actually an interesting mention as well, because I do think that Jafar could also make a bit of a comeback with these Emerald Steel decks out of the meta. I know, like, for example, we don't talk about Bruno can cause Jafar some issues, and I think Jafar's definitely one to keep an eye on. I think it's got a pretty good matchup into Ruby Amethyst, for example, so I'm excited to see all of the different decks making a comeback. All right, Jan, it's been a pleasure. Where can people find you if they want to watch more of your stuff?
I haven't been streaming much recently, so just on my Twitter, and I do a weekly podcast with Kawa and Brandon called Podcana, which you can find anywhere.
And I heard that this hat you're wearing, you're going to be giving to me for free next time I see you. Is that right?
That's very much wrong.
What? You let me wear it the other day, and what was it you quoted me if I wanted to buy it off you?
60 euros.
60 euros! He's having
At
an
least.
absolute laugh. It is a nice hat, though. How many prize tickets was it?
Was 12 tickets, and one ticket was close to 5 euros, I heard, on the black market.
The black market. I do not condone such things, but yeah, I think you could.
I just heard about it.
Yeah, you could, like, one booster pack costs like one ticket, right? Which I
No,
think.
it's 2 tickets.
Okay.
But no one wanted boosters. The promos were much better
Right.
when they were still there.
Yeah. All right, Jan, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks so much for joining me. And let us know in the comments what you think about the change to Bucky, Squirrel, Squeak Tutor. Are you happy to see the back of the Squirrel? Do you think they should have just banned the card? Do you think it's been over-nerfed? Or do you support Ravensburger in their decision to just nerf Bucky to the ground and ensure it's not going to be a problem? I think the other thing, just as I mentioned, Jan, is the fact that it is so heavily nerfed means that it's not going to be a common situation where people are playing the card in competitive decks and then having to explain the errata to people. I think that's maybe another reason.
Yeah, that too. And also, I don't think anyone was financially hurt by their Bucky now losing value or gaining values. That was a 2-cent card. Everyone would be fine.
The promo card, the promo Bucky card that exists, has been completely bought out, though, interestingly. So that's pretty cool. All right, take care, everyone. See you very soon. You're supposed to say bye.
Bye.